Well, welcome back, everybody, to this episode of Left Reckoning. We're really, really lucky and excited to be joined today by Dr. Assal Rad, who is the research director at the National Iranian American Council. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Happy to be here.
Well, we got a lot to get to, so let's not dilly-dally too much. We really wanted to start by, setting the scene, sort of talking about the Biden administration and the Iran nuclear deal. But before we get there, could you just sort of briefly explain what Donald Trump's posture toward Iran was during his presidency?
So Trump really comes in with this anti-Iran deal attitude specifically. Of course, this is coupled with the fact that he has all of these Islamophobic comments, the Muslim ban itself. So he has this hostile rhetoric, obviously, towards most of the Muslim world. And then specifically on the Iran deal, he was a strong critic of it. Now, what ends up happening under the Trump administration is originally the Secretary of State is Rex Tillerson. And Rex Tillerson has a bit more of a pragmatic approach than his successor, which is Mike Pompeo. And Pompeo has really like an obsession with Iran, not only obsessed with Iran, but a very, very, everybody knows his stance on Israel, which is ironclad support, sort of an extreme stance on that. And to juxtapose that, he has a very anti-Iran attitude. The other advisor that Trump brings on is John Bolton, or was John Bolton. And Bolton also has a sort of history of let's bomb Iran. I mean, he's literally written op-eds, I think, titled "It's Time to Bomb Iran." So while Trump himself may have stated that, all he wanted to do was create a deal that prevented Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which ironically is exactly what the Iran nuclear deal did. He stated he doesn't want a war, that he didn't want regime change, that none of these things were his goal. And I think it's possible to sort of take him for his word that really he just wanted to be able to slap his name onto a deal and say, this is better than what Obama did, which is what we saw as a pattern in the Trump administration in general. But the people he surrounded himself with to make those decisions had a very different agenda. And that was also very clear, right? So again, we know that that Pompeo and Bolton had a different idea of what to do with Iran than Trump did. I mean, you have videos of John Bolton speaking in front of the MEK, what was a formerly designated terrorist organization in the United States, is still a terrorist organization designated in Iran. So I think it was in like 2019 or 18, he's speaking in front of the MEK and saying, we'll have this conference next year in Tehran. So I mean, the people around him clearly wanted to escalate a conflict and not to get a better deal. So his posture, Trump's posture was very strongly centered, or at least the administration's posture was very strongly centered on getting rid of the deal and painting this picture of Iran as sort of this global menace that had to be dealt with, all while also, there were mixed signals. On one hand, it was, we want to get a better deal. On the other hand, it was, no, this government has to go. So that didn't really create an atmosphere where it was possible to engage in negotiations. And then after the assassination of Iran's general, Qasem Soleimani, I mean, the Iranian government took the posture of, we will not negotiate with basically the murderers of one of our top generals. So that made diplomacy very difficult, especially when his top diplomat really never wanted to engage in diplomacy with Iran.
And I mean, but before we get to Biden too, I do just want to set the stage a little bit for folks, because not only is it just ridiculous that Trump pulls out of the nuclear deal, and just reminding folks again, there was nothing going on there that was like Iran had sort of breached the protocols or the agreement there. The U.S. just unilaterally pulled out of it. But following that, like if that's not bad enough, you then basically have these sanctions, and then which were really devastating to the people of Iran, especially during COVID. I know it was really hard, for example, for people to get basic medicine. And you always get these kind of apologists who are saying like, well, actually in the, according to the rules here, there are no restrictions on medicine. But when you create a regime, a situation like that, it basically makes it difficult for any company to want to do business with Iran, because they're worried that, if we, step over the line here or we're investigated here, we might be facing punishment and sanctions from the U.S. as well. I mean, could you give people a sense of just, how difficult life was for everyday Iranians during this period of the Trump administration with these kind of enhanced sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, it was called a maximum pressure campaign or policy, right? And just to note, they still live under those sanctions. And I know we'll get into the Biden administration, but this is not a past tense situation. They're still living under the same economic pressure, which is, now exacerbated, just like it is everywhere in the world, by the ongoing war in Ukraine, right? So now these, you take a pandemic, you take another war, all of these factors compound the impact of sanctions on the Iranian populace. And so maximum pressure was exactly what it was. It was meant to really put pressure. And this is, if you look at things said by the administration, Pompeo even said, the Iranian people will sort of eventually, they'll know what to do. It was that kind of an attitude. It's like clear you're putting pressure on the people. And so this whole humanitarian goods are exempt argument is one of the most frustrating things to listen to, because yes, on paper, they are. We all agree. That's what's written down. But what is happening on the ground is completely different. And if you don't believe me, you can listen to our current president, who wrote in April of 2020 a statement calling on the Trump administration at the time to ease sanctions in light of COVID on Iran, specifically to address the fact that despite the fact that there are humanitarian exemptions, essential goods are being impeded into getting into the country. So this is something that our current president stated outright. And other officials have clearly spoken to when they oppose certain sanctions or this sort of like blanket. I mean, you have Iran's entire financial sector is sanctioned. We have not only are Iranians in Iran obviously completely impacted, but over-compliance of sanctions is so much that Iranian Americans are impacted. Iranian Americans get their big accounts closed. If you use words like Iran or Persian in a Venmo transaction, they'll freeze your accounts on the spot. So imagine no one is willing to do any kind of transaction that involves Iran, even if it's humanitarian, because it's not, a bank is a business. They're not willing to risk their business to run afoul of U.S. sanctions. And so that's really what the Trump administration did, coupled with leaving the deal. Mind you, they're the only party. The United States continues to be, because we still haven't returned to it, the only party that actually quit and left the deal. You mentioned the fact that Iran was in compliance with the deal when the U.S. decided to unilaterally quit. Not only is this true, Iran stayed in full compliance for a year after the U.S. quit. It was only until they realized there was absolutely no way that other parties to the deal, that the Europeans could actually hold up the promises of economic relief, that they started to take calculated measures to reduce their compliance with the deal. And what is one of the reasons why the Europeans couldn't? Secondary U.S. sanctions. It wasn't just that the Trump administration went after Iran itself. They went after anyone who would even attempt to do business with Iran. I mean, that level of sanctions really impacts the economy. You had, to your point, there were shortages of specialized medicines, right? I mean, Iran has been sanctioned for decades. And so they have learned to be self-sufficient in certain ways. They produce a lot, like something like 97% of their own medicines.
Wow.
But there are specialized medicines and specialized medical supplies that they import. And that's what made it difficult. So you have chemo patients suffering without getting their medicine. There was a shortage of insulin at one point. You have shortages of medicines for specialized diseases. And these are, life-saving remedies that they can't get their hands on because of sanctions. So, the impact, it's hard to overstate it. You have millions of middle-class Iranians, something like 10 to 15% of the middle class was pushed into poverty. That's millions of people in the middle class pushed into poverty. And this is all under this particular set of sanctions. So and I will make this point, while mismanagement and corruption of Iran's government is certainly a factor, an essential factor, and certainly the factor that Iranians themselves will cite the most in terms of their current situation. This government has existed for over 40 years, but this set of sanctions is what's created hyperinflation in the country, where all of a sudden their money is devalued, to a point where basic goods are hard to purchase, even when they are available. So, I mean, the impact is just across the board, except for the very wealthy. And it's the same thing we see in every country, right? Every time there's an economic impact on ordinary people, the wealthy don't suffer, the officials don't suffer, governments don't suffer. It's ordinary people across the spectrum that are suffering, and that's happening a lot, and it continues to.
No, totally. And like, I know it's like a small example, but just the Venmo thing, like I've experienced that before where you're just trying to pay somebody back for a kebab or whatever. Yeah. And like, you get it flagged and like, it's funny and, a little trivial, but like, it just shows how far these companies go and bend over backwards to try to stay in compliance that, you could be in Los Angeles and just trying to pay somebody back for dinner. And you're going to get flagged by these systems.
I actually want to give you an example just to show how ridiculous compliance is. Etsy took down a shop of an Iranian American woman who was making something called Persian dolls. And Etsy took down the shop because the word Persian was in what she was selling. They were dolls being sold by an Iranian American. So, I mean, imagine if, these things aren't severely impacting this community, but obviously it causes, for some people, especially the people who get their bank accounts closed, it does cause economic and financial hardship. But, you have to just imagine if it's manifesting in these ways in this country, what's actually happening to the targeted country.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's catch up to Biden here, because, one of the things that, like, when people are sort of making their kind of pragmatic arguments for why people should support Biden in 2020 versus sitting out the election or something like that, one of the main ones you saw from progressives was the Iran deal. And like, we can't continue Trump's policies here. But how would you sort of categorize the early Biden administration's, role here, and specifically when it comes to the Iran deal and sort of undoing what Trump put in place when he was president?
Absolutely. You talk about progressive groups and progressives in America. I count myself in the organization I work for amongst them. And yes, we felt that for many, many reasons, by the way, this was not a one issue election by any means. But sometimes the deal is not understood for its magnitude, right? The deal isn't just about nuclear non-proliferation, which is the central point of it, right? The central point. And now I think with the ongoing war and the fear of a nuclear war with Russia, we're understanding again why it's so important that we avoid an arms race in, say, the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, and instead we ensure that more nuclear weapons aren't being created in the world. Not only did it do that, but it also averted another war by the United States. Right now, today, the Times of Israel released a report saying that the Biden administration or the U.S. is going to participate in a simulation, in like a military simulation of Israeli strikes on Iran. It's like it's not really the best approach to diplomacy, is it? To start simulating how you would attack the country. But why? Why is that even happening? Because they're telling you themselves, what's the alternative? If we're not going to get back into the deal, and you have all of these presidents and officials who have promised, in their very aggressive language, we won't have a nuclear Iran. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative that they themselves clearly have considered and are considering is war. So you have an administration that comes in saying they're going to end endless war, and yet by not going back to the deal, we're putting ourselves on a path to potentially not only another war in the Middle East, but one where, Afghanistan and Iraq would pale in comparison. Yeah. They're not comparable situations. Iran right now is not a comparable country to Iraq of 2003 or Afghanistan of 2001. So it's actually a really big deal, but we're not talking about it as much as we should be. So what did the Biden administration do? We thought, well, they're going to restore the deal. That's what they said they're going to do. Biden, Blinken, other officials within the Biden administration lambasted the Trump administration and Trump officials for every decision they made on Iran, every single decision. In 2017, before Trump had even withdrawn from the deal, you already had Joe Biden tweeting about what a mistake it would be to withdraw from the deal. Again, Joe Biden himself, this was never meant to be a catch-all. This deal was working. After the assassination of Soleimani, again, Biden has a press conference lambasting the Trump administration, calling him irresponsible, saying that he has no congressional authority to instigate a war with Iran. These are all things that are coming out of Joe Biden as a candidate. And so the assumption was, okay, it's easy to reverse. It was a decision made by executive order. It can be reversed by executive order. The US can go back to the deal. Early on, the Biden administration doesn't really address the Iran deal. While on day one of his administration, he rescinded the Muslim ban, returned the US to the Paris Climate Accord. He took those types of actions. He didn't do the same thing with the Iran deal. And in reality, all the sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions that we're talking about, remain in place. While this administration has sort of claimed to want to engage in diplomacy and is to a certain extent obviously engaging in these negotiations, at the same time they talk about good faith efforts on the Iranian side, and yet again the news that you see today, I mean, is practicing drills to carry out airstrikes on a country good faith? I would say no. The pandemic is ongoing, right? You had Biden in 2020 saying that the sanctions that are impeding the flow of essential goods to Iran must be addressed by the Trump administration. He has yet to do anything himself. He's now a year and a half into his own presidency. We just marked 1 million American deaths from COVID. So clearly this is still a disease that is killing people across the globe, including Iran. Yet those sanctions remain in place. So while in talk and in rhetoric, the Biden administration has engaged in negotiations, at the same time, they keep falling for the sort of traps that the Trump administration set for them. Right now, one of the biggest impediments to returning to the deal is the FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list that the United States has, that designation on the IRGC. It's purely symbolic because the IRGC has its own sanctions, it's separately designated. Even if you were to take them off of the FTO list, they would remain a sanctioned entity. This is something, again, that officials were critical of when the Trump administration did it, and yet we still haven't reversed it. So there are things that Biden could do that he's essentially choosing not to.
And we're getting a lot of, like, on the Revolutionary Guard Council designation as a terrorist organization by the U.S. Like, we're getting a lot of devil speak from the U.S. too, where they're saying, oh, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really affect too much of our policy. And yet this seems to be like the line in the sand about really returning to the negotiating table.
Well, I mean, we're in so many rounds of negotiations. I don't even know what round we'd be in. I think 9 at this point. But because there were a couple of delays. The first delay was by the Biden administration, under the excuse that, well, they're still there. He's appointing, different cabinet members. He's still getting his administration in order. And so it took some time. Of course, there was an election in Iran in June of 2021 as well. So when the incoming Raisi administration took its time, they were criticized for doing precisely what the Biden administration did, right? Which is, well, we got to get our ducks in order before we can engage in anything. Really, the window of opportunity was when the Rouhani administration was still in power. That was the administration that wanted the deal, that negotiated the deal, and that desperately wanted to return to it. But again, these sort of lagging steps on the Biden admin part put us in the current situation we're in. But you had Antony Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, I think it was maybe about 2 weeks ago, saying exactly what you said, which is, well, the designation is essentially meaningless. But here we are. So it's sort of a cognitive dissonance to listen to the administration speak. I mean, it may reveal the fact that there are internal dynamics, right? And internal maybe camps that don't necessarily agree on what to do. And ultimately that decision then lays with the president himself. Right. So we can talk about the officials all we want, but ultimately it's the presidents that make these decisions, and their cabinet members carry out the decisions that they want. So ultimately, this falls on President Biden's shoulders. And you'll hear a lot of talk from the administration trying to blame their predecessor, right? Well, the Trump administration, this is what we inherited. But these are decisions that can be made to overturn exactly what their predecessor did. And again, it's a choice.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
we've been calling Biden the press release president ever since that story that he was going. The U.S. was going to stop supporting offensive actions in Yemen, and it's like, well, you have to wait until the details come out, and there's never any follow through. It's just a nice story for a few days, and yeah.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. There's so many examples of that, and of course, offensive. There was that term is right. We're just going to be very technical, except for the fact that we're still, you had hundreds of billions of dollars hundreds of millions of dollars in sales to arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Their offensive war, apparently. So, and you see the same thing with the Iran deal. It is very sort of frustrating, obviously, for those who tried to support the administration as our best of bad alternatives, and to see, there's another one early in the administration. They said they were going to do a review of sanctions, especially sanctions and humanitarian impact. That was what I believe the first statement was in January of 2021. And then in October of 2021, so something like 9 months or 10 months later, they release a 9-page report. So a page per month, essentially, which doesn't really address anything. Basically, what the report says is, well, sanctions are good. It's just that our predecessor didn't do it good enough because he didn't get enough partners along to do it. And there was like one paragraph about humanitarian exemptions with no actual steps to address how that's going to happen. So yeah, this has been, unfortunately, the sort of pattern with this administration is to talk but not deliver.
Can you speak to? Sorry, Dave, just to jump in real quick. But while we got you, the achievement of the Iran deal in the first place, for about 7 years on, so like the first draft of history. What should people understand of that they got it done in the first place?
There's a few things that are really important about the deal. In terms of, again, what's like the central purpose of the deal? The central purpose is to basically have international monitoring on Iran, to ensure, because Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. So Iran is already a signatory to an international agreement that says they are not pursuing nuclear weapons, but nuclear technology has other applications, energy, medicine, etc. Right? So they're allowed to have a civilian nuclear program, but as a signatory to the NPT, they can't have a weaponized program, which they state themselves. They have repeatedly stated that is not their intended goal, which is why they're a signatory to the NPT. Yet, out of fear that Iran is going to become a nuclear weapons state, they were sanctioned by the US, they were sanctioned by the United Nations, and so that's where the agreement came from. It said, okay, let's create international oversight that allows us to ensure as an international community that Iran is not weaponizing its program. Now, according to, and I am not a non-proliferation expert, but according to non-proliferation experts, these are the people who spent their entire careers working on the issue of nuclear weapons and non-proliferation. This was the strongest non-proliferation deal ever, right? They say it's unprecedented international monitoring of Iran's program. So in terms of what the central goal was, it accomplished it absolutely. By creating those monitors, you could ensure that Iran does not weaponize its program. And what it really should have been, instead of wasting the last however many years, going back and forth, was a model for non-proliferation. So, if we're concerned about Iran being a nuclear state, Iran and many of the states in the region have tried to entertain the idea of making the Middle East a nuclear-free zone. Of course, there's only one country in the Middle East that actually has nuclear weapons, and that's Israel. So guess who objects to this? Israel and the United States. Because the United States won't even acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons. But if our actual objective as an international community was to, prevent nuclear weapons, then there's your solution. Make the entire region nuclear free. But of course, we don't do that. We, as in the United States, won't accept that because we want to make sure that Israel has a nuclear advantage. Now, there are secondary benefits to the deal. That's not the issue itself. One of the major ones being that you had the United States and Iran these adversaries who, at least from their own like rhetoric on the Iranian side and on the US side, had for decades been so aggressive. Always this, I can tell you as an Iranian American, you always think like they're going to go to war one day, right? Like there's always that fear in your mind. And here was this moment where you saw the fruits of diplomacy. Like that's when diplomacy really works. Is not when agreeing with your friends is not diplomacy. That's just agreeing with each other. But getting to an agreement with your adversaries is the entire point of diplomacy. It's to avert war and to, reconcile issues through dialogue. And that's precisely what it did. For Iranians themselves, and this is why you saw images of Iranians flooding the streets to celebrate the deal, it was also seen as a sort of turning point, right? You had this revolutionary government who came into power in 1979, consistently used anti-US, imperialist rhetoric. And the fact that that very state still came to the negotiating table with the United States and engaged in diplomacy was a huge deal. It seemed like a turning point. Because it was, one of the first things that Iran did after the agreement was a $20 billion deal with Boeing, an American company, to order a new fleet of commercial airplanes, which are affected, by the way, by sanctions. Wildly dangerous to fly in because sanctions don't allow them to get parts for their commercial airplanes. To my mind, that part of the deal was even more consequential because of its implications, right? You have the non-proliferation part, but you also have the part where you're like, diplomacy works. If we want it to work, it can work. And this idea that, in the US, we constantly say, Iran can't be trusted, and you still hear it all the time. Iran can't be trusted. They abided by the deal. We didn't.
And I mean, just to hit on the plane parts thing. I mean, I can't remember if this was last year or a couple of years ago, but there was a crash that happened because you have defunct equipment, and this is just one of the things that people in the U.S. should have a better understanding of this now, having sort of lived through supply chain issues and not being able to get basic kind of things. Like the United States is a very advanced economy; it's the wealthiest country in the world, and even us, we're very much interconnected internationally for our basic kind of production needs. And you see, this was, caused by, pandemics and slowing down of trade because of COVID-19. But you see even the United States struggles to be able to provide sort of these, services that we sort of expect as basic in a moment like that. Imagine what it's like for a country like Iran, which, as you were saying earlier, they do a lot of internal production. But, it really severely limits your economy when you're cut off from the rest of the world.
Think about the baby formula situation in the US right now. Right. And it's a huge deal. And we're not even talking about it as much as we should, because again, it has so many implications. The fact that we are as powerful and as wealthy as we are still dependent on trade and supply chains and other countries and all of these things. And to imagine that this country has a baby formula shortage, just think about being sanctioned by this country, the most powerful economy in the world, for years. It's hard to imagine the impact that it has. And, it's not to say that, on the Iranian side, people, just like everywhere else, they're resilient. They try to, continue to live. They have no other choice than to adjust and try to figure out a way to get around the situation that exists. But it's a dire situation. It's a very, very challenging situation for a country that has, if you have one economic factor working against you, it's a problem. If you have multiple economic factors working against you, a lot of people are hurting.
Well, I want to come back to the current status of the nuclear deal, but I don't think we can get there until we sort of introduce the new president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi. Could you give people a sort of just general understanding of who he is, where he came from, and how he ended up winning this election? Because he won by a sizable amount, though I know a lot of people basically had feelings that it wasn't. The selection process, at least, was not completely above water. But I'd be curious to hear your sort of framing of Raisi and his administration so far.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of reasons why that election wasn't above water, so to speak, and why someone like Raisi would would be the one to win. Starting with the fact that, well, first of all, Raisi is like an ultra, you can call him hardliner, conservative. Essentially, he's, if we're looking at like a political spectrum, he's towards the right, right? This is not, whereas you had his predecessor in the Rouhani administration, that especially in terms of their diplomacy, they wanted to engage specifically the United States and the West, which goes, like I said, in terms of rhetoric, it goes against sort of a lot of what the official lines of the state are. But that was clearly the direction that they were looking in. Now, this administration is different. They're not seeking the same kind of, they're seeking to return to the deal, to relieve the country of sanctions, but that's not their sort of like gaze. You see more of a diplomatic gaze towards the region itself, and maybe even towards the East, which is quite different than the Rouhani administration. It's also much more conservative. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that are under this administration are themselves human rights abusers, including Raisi himself. So, it's in my opinion, at least, it's not a good administration in terms of carrying out the needs of the Iranian people. But here's a few things to understand about the political landscape. So Raisi actually ran against Rouhani in the 2017 election and lost very badly. Rouhani won by millions of more votes. Why? Because typically in Iran, it's similar to the US dynamic. If a lot of people turn out to vote, then the more moderate or reformist sort of camps will win. If there's low voter turnout, then the conservative camps will win, which is very similar to the dynamic in the US. If you get a lot of voter turnout, usually Democrat, left, liberal will win. If you get low voter turnout, more conservative, right, Republicans will win. What happened, so this is why Raisi was, blown away in the 2017 election. But in 2021, there are multiple factors that play into why you have very low voter turnout. In fact, record low voter turnout since Iran has held elections of this manner over the last 40 years or so. First, the fact that you mentioned the sort of vetting process, right? Iran it's a complicated system because while it has like a democratic apparatus, right? It has like a constitution, it has an elected government, essentially. It has also an unelected government that over sort of powers the elected government. And that's what makes it authoritarian and not democratic. But it has the apparatus in place, and who is president affects the policies of the country and affects the lives of the people. But within, still within a limited sort of frame, if that makes sense. So this vetting process is not a democratic process. And they eliminated not only, the vast majority of the candidates, but they eliminated some, like Ali Larijani is someone who, this family is like a staple of the Islamic Republic. This is certainly not someone who's against the Islamic Republic. And yet even a central figure like him was eliminated from the election. So there really wasn't viable competition because that process eliminated that competition. Now, couple that like frustration of, they don't even get really to select the candidates that they want to run in terms of the people. Couple that with the utter failure of the Rouhani administration to deliver on its promises, because its central promise was economic relief that was based on the JCPOA. It was based on the Iran nuclear deal. Not only did their situation not get better, under maximum pressure, their situation got much worse. Add a pandemic, and you get a lot less people who are, willing to go out and vote. And I will be fascinated to see what happens in the US in 2024 when you compare voting maybe in 2020 to 2024. It's just sort of what happens is all the what would galvanize people to vote, no factor existed. And so there were different reasons why people didn't vote, but they just didn't. A much smaller voter turnout brings someone like Raisi to power. Now, what does that mean? Raisi represents a certain segment of Iranian society. I would argue not the majority, right? That's why when you have higher voter turnout, you get a different type of candidate who wins. Nonetheless, he does represent a certain segment of the society that leans in the same like camp and direction. But on one hand, the concern with this administration coming in was, would they engage in negotiations with the Biden administration, with the U.S. in order to return to the deal? Every indication is that they've continued those negotiations, and that they would go through with fulfilling those promises if both sides were to return to compliance. But again, whereas under the Rouhani administration, the deal was seen as a sort of stepping stone where diplomacy could grow, where you could see the sort of these adversarial relationships cool and maybe not become allies, but find other ways that we could cooperate, because Iran and the U.S. in fact do have reasons to cooperate. They're both they both fight against ISIS. They both take issue with the Taliban in Afghanistan. There are areas in which cooperation of these two states could not only help U.S. interests, but also security interests within the region as a whole. So whereas that was sort of the hope of the deal under that administration, with the Raisi administration, it feels like it's the ceiling. Like if we could just get that, that's as far as this administration is likely to go.
I mean, it's
short. Oh, go ahead, David.
I just wanted to ask. I mean, it's because it's a huge setback. I was just curious if you could let people know, because like there's this brief window of time where you still have the Rouhani government in power, right? I mean, how much of a sense before Raisi is elected was there that it was probably going to go in that direction? I mean, like what I'm trying to say is that, like, I think we can be frustrated with Biden in any circumstances for not just sort of running to the negotiating table and, renegotiating the deal or re-entering the deal. But I mean, was there some kind of writing on the wall that, like, this probably is our like 5-month window that we have to try to get back on that course before an administration that comes into power that's going to be far less amenable to negotiation comes into play?
100%. Absolutely. And this is the interesting thing is if people like myself, right? Supporters, advocates of diplomacy, supporters of the deal, especially anybody who actually is, familiar with the region and has some level of expertise on Iran in particular, or really anything, just any analyst who was looking at the situation and was for diplomacy, right? If you were an analyst looking at the situation, you were pro-war, we're not reading the situation the same way, or at least we're not advocating the same things because we want opposite outcomes. But those of us who were advocates had argued under the Trump administration that by doing this, by rescinding on the deal, by putting these maximum pressure sanctions on, the U.S. is basically undermining moderate and reformist voices in Iran, and that it would help to usher in precisely the administration that comes in, which is Raisi. And the reason for this is not because we're all psychic; it's because it's sort of an obvious thing that happens when an administration promises to do something and they fail to do it, they lose popularity. And in the U.S. has had a history of doing this. We've done the same thing to different reformists and different, not even reformists, but just different administrations in Iran who have tried to sort of put out an olive branch. It's interesting for those who are actually privy to that history. It's the U.S. that constantly deflects it. So, there's this image that Iran is just this fanatic state that has, there's no pragmatism. They're just anti-US and they hate us. I don't know, because we're free, apparently. I don't know what people say about this, but that's just not the reality of the history. One important case in point that I would say is Iran's first reformist president elected in the late 1990s, Mohammad Khatami, was all about like the dialogue of civilizations. And he came to the US and did interviews and talked about his admiration of the American people. Behind the scenes, Iran was helping the State Department with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So there was, this was the sort of atmosphere that we were in. After 9/11, Khatami condemns the attacks. Iranians hold vigil for the victims. And then in George Bush's State of the Union address, he names Iran as part of an axis of evil. Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, none of which had anything to do with 9/11. So this has happened before, where it's like you have this attempt at detente and then it's totally undermined. And what happens is usually the pendulum flips. So yes, we were saying this under the Trump administration. It was like, hey, this is not going to go in the direction that you want. This is actually going to embolden the sort of like the elements that we all agree on, which is, the human rights abusers in the country, the hardliners, the conservatives, the people who want to take people's rights away, who don't want to engage in diplomacy, that's who you're emboldening. And that's exactly what happened. Now, once the Biden admin came in, it was the exact same argument. It was like, look, you have this golden window. You have this window of opportunity. Capitalize on it. Mm-hmm. And of course, instead of doing that, and I will never quite understand the logic behind this, but maybe I don't have a politician's mind, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But instead of listening to instead of the Biden administration listening to supporters, right, the people who actually helped him get elected, they focused the early months on, well, we got to talk to Saudi Arabia and Israel and see what they have to say about the deal. Well, we know what they have to say about the deal. They didn't like it. Well, we have to make sure, Republicans are agreeing with the deal. Like, they don't like it. They've told you this over and over again. So rather than, focusing on the people who actually elected them, they focused on the people who were never going to be on their side. They were just never going to switch sides on this particular topic. So yeah, all those opportunities, predictably, that were lost led to the situation that we're in. But they were all said ahead of time, and so that's what I mean when I say these are just choices. It's not like the information is not readily available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that actually answers the question I was going to ask, which is like the sort of way I heard it put when I was learning about all this stuff and hearing John Bolton's name for the first time like 15 years ago, where the hardliners mutually reinforce each other. And it seems like that's exactly what's happened.
That's actually exactly what it is. Commentators on pro-diplomacy side will always use that example. It's like, well, just like we have hawks in the US who have done everything they can to thwart diplomacy, Iran has that too. They're called hardliners. And so the people that they tend to criticize, they are in certain ways a mirror image of. And I mean, there are other fascinating sort of parallels when you look at the US and Iran in terms of its political structure, because those factions also tend to be the most religiously inclined, right? The most religiously extreme, at least in their views. So yeah, the same dynamics exist, and I think sometimes that's lost, right? Iran is seen as this monolith, whereas it's an extreme. I mean, it's over 80 million people. It's a diverse country. It has diverse political views, and that is true of its own government. Just like we have members of Congress who basically hate each other, right? They hate each other openly on Twitter. The same thing exists in Iran and any other country. Like, these governments are still just made up of part of that population. And so they're not all the same. They don't see things all the same way. And there's definitely a parallel between the hardline camps in both sides.
Yeah, I mean, it's endlessly frustrating, honestly, how a lot of people in the US sometimes they like flatten like entire countries to, one image when, I don't know, you just need to walk outside your own house to see that, people have very different opinions on lots of different stuff. But I wanted to ask about these food protests, because I've seen these headlines starting to pop up over the past few days that there have been pretty significant protests in several cities across Iran about the increase in food prices, primarily, flour-based foods. Could you talk about that a little bit? And then I am just curious to hear your thoughts about how that's being covered in the U.S. as well. And yeah, I just go there, and I have something else to add in a little bit.
I'm actually glad that you brought up the food protests as well, because I think it's important to sort of understand the different factors that contribute to the current situation. I mean, first and foremost, it is important to say that the use of force against protesters, whether it's Iran, whether it's Palestine, whether it's the US, it does not matter where it is. The use of force against protesters is not only wrong, but actually violates, human rights obligations that are understood under international law. People have the right to assemble. People have the right to share their grievances, especially when the grievances are 100% rightful. I mean, you have a population that is suffering from every side. They're suffering under the corruption and mismanagement of their own government. They are suffering under sanctions, which have made it worse. They are suffering under a pandemic, which has caused global economic disruptions. And they are suffering now, compounded on top of all of those things, because of the food supply chains that have been affected by the war in Ukraine. I mean, look at the US right now. People are struggling. They were already struggling, first of all. They've been struggling for a long time, but they're struggling even more because gas prices are like triple what they used to be. Inflation is out of control. And this is the wealthiest country in the world. This is one of the most affluent populations in the world. And so many people are struggling, partially because what happens, wealth is constant. We're wealthy because there's a few people who have a lot of wealth, but the vast majority do not actually have that wealth. They are not gaining wealth generation after generation. They're just surviving, essentially. And so you see that this is a phenomenon that exists across the world, essentially. Iran is not unique in that sense. There are people who are still doing well because they will continue to do so. There are, when we talk about sanctions, one of the parts that people rarely talk about is how sanctions benefit, the black market and the very elements that we're talking about, that the corruption and all of that. Guess where a lot of it comes from? Sanctions, right? Because when you're trying to figure out a way to get around something, there's always a lot of money to be made, and that's where a lot of corruption comes from. So sanctions actually exacerbate not only the economic situation, but the corruption of those states. So they have to deal with all of these things, and now the announcement, protests actually started in Iran's southwestern province of Khuzestan a week ago. Because of an announcement that bread subsidies would be cut. So the state subsidizes a lot of these food products because people would not be able to afford them otherwise. It's the Raisi administration who's choosing to cut these subsidies. And that sparked protests there. Those protests have spread to other areas of southwestern Iran, and then continue to spread to northern and central cities as well, where you see working class and poor Iranians really, really struggling to survive. And when suddenly, you have reports that say the price of staples like chicken, eggs, dairy products are going up 300%, they simply can't afford it. And so that desperation and frustration spills out into the streets. And you can't, rightfully so, as would anybody in that kind of a situation. Now, while those protests are sparked by these prices, there are deeper fissures within the society. We saw this in 2019 when there were protests in Iran. They originated because of an announcement of the Rouhani administration that gas would suddenly become much more expensive. And this, again, same demographics were protesting throughout different areas of the country. Whereas maybe protests in the past in Iran, like if you look back at 2009 in the Green Movement, it's a very different demographic and sort of geography of where protests are taking place. This is really people who are most impacted by these policies and most impacted by just trying to sustain their livelihoods. But of course, their frustrations are with their own government, as they would be in any case, right? Usually when people protest, they protest their own government. They don't protest other governments. And I say that because it's not just the Iranian government is certainly the most central figure that is responsible for the situation of its own people. But I think as someone who sits, especially as an Iranian American, right, someone who is of Iranian heritage, but born and raised in the United States, as someone who understands what's happening there, it's not that I think that we can necessarily solve those problems, but we could at the very least not exacerbate them. We could not foment them. We could not flame them constantly. And I think that's the frustration with U.S. policies is, this concept can be applied to our policies domestically as well. We create problems and then try to fix them after we've helped to create those problems. And then usually our policies and our solutions make them worse.
I totally agree. And it's just to wrap things up. One thing that, one of the reasons, we've been wanting to get you on the program for a long time now, actually, but one of the reasons I reached out is that there's something about the way that Iran is being covered right now in the U.S. that feels, unfortunately, like very retro, right? We're getting like a lot of this like breakout time paranoia that, Iran is, just a few weeks away or whatever from, completing a nuclear weapon. Israel has been, I think earlier today, they're announcing that they found more centrifuges in Iran. And we don't have to speak necessarily to the validity of that, but there is that kind of, like there was, I feel like in the mid 2000s and the early 2010s, this kind of like anything goes when it comes to talking about Iran. That I think only exacerbates, at least for the general American, this kind of propagandized way that most people think about the country. It makes me very, very worried about, the potential of conflict, especially in the situation that the Biden administration has been so slow to really reignite, this kind of diplomacy that was so helpful and moving and, meant a lot to a lot of people. Just in the last, couple of moments, I would just be curious to hear your thoughts on, where you're feeling about, what comes next and, your just sort of perspective as an Iranian American, the way that these things are being talked about in the kind of recent events as well.
Well, I can tell you from my perspective, this is how they've always been talked about. So I actually authored a report that we released early January called Othering Iran. And the main argument of the report was to say our policies on Iran are really like nonsense, like they're irrational. If you look at, and it's not just Iran, we have irrational policies, especially in foreign policy. US policy is not looked at as being ideological, but it is, right? Like just the fact that we use phrases like unconditional support for Israel, that doesn't even make sense. Like if you just think about it for 1 minute with a grain of logic, to say that something has no condition is a fanatic statement. To say it doesn't matter what you do, no matter what you do, we're still going to support you.
No, you can kill an American journalist.
You could do that and nothing would change and we would send you more money. So it is ideological. And the flip side of that is this sort of like anti-Iran attitude, right? It is so easy to say really racist things about Iran and Iranians and no one seems to really bat an eye. Like it's just, yeah, that's normal. I mean, you had a Senator Risch like a month ago or so talking the Republican Senate had a press briefing to talk about how much they hate the Iran deal. And in it, he said something, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, I don't speak Persian, but even if I did, I don't think I could find the words good faith because I don't think good faith exists in their language.
Jesus Christ.
Huh. Well, I mean, that's a blanket statement. I mean, that's the language of not only Iranians, by the way, but countless other people, millions of people around the world. But this is commonplace. This has been happening for decades. I mean, the depiction of Iran and Iranians in US, whether it's popular culture, right? Whether it's film and television, whether it's what actual US politicians are saying, or the news media. It is this constant menace and they're bad and they're evil and for some reason they're out to get us. What's really interesting about it is and this is an Orientalist trope, is that they are simultaneously a menace that's so powerful that it has reach everywhere in the world and on the verge of collapse. Always. It's always extremely weak and extremely strong at the same time. And that's because it's just a matter of what purpose it serves rhetorically when you're talking about something. You just want to say something. So, they're very strong in this context. In this context, they're very weak. We can take them out. But in terms of specifically, you brought up breakout time. And I think this is an important opportunity to address the concept of breakout time. Breakout time is a totally arbitrary measure. It's not a real measure of anything. But it's used to say, it was used as like a selling point of the nuclear deal to say that we can create some kind of measure to tell people we've made the breakout time 12 months. Breakout time is not a nuclear weapon. I have to clarify this point.
Yes.
When they say they're weeks away from a nuclear weapon, that is totally false. Iran is not weeks away from a nuclear weapon. By the way, we've been saying they're like weeks away from a nuclear weapon for like decades. So this is the slowest moving weeks I've ever seen in my life. But breakout time is the amount of nuclear material that you would need in order to create a nuclear weapon. You would actually need the weapon itself. You would actually need a delivery system to deliver the weapon. So Iran is 1 to 2 years out if it chooses to, and that's the second important part, if it chooses to, it's 1 to 2 years out from being able to even have a nuclear weapon. So the whole fear tactic of talking about it like in days they're going to have a nuclear weapon is simply technically not true. It's impossible for them to do so. But the second point was they have to make the choice to do so, right? All of our actions are based on the pure assumption that Iran wants a nuclear weapon, period. And yet the country that apparently wants a nuclear weapon is the country that agreed to having unprecedented international monitoring of its nuclear program and abided by it. And by the way, even the Trump administration knows that they abided by it. That's why they certified the deal multiple times until they withdrew from it in 2018. So it is verifiable fact that IAEA has multiple reports that Iran was abiding by a deal that put unprecedented international monitoring on its program and is a signatory to the NPT. But we have to work under the assumption that no matter what, they've always wanted a weapon. The other thing, and I know that we're out of time, I just wanted to add.
Oh, no, this is great.
My biggest concern is that Iran has consistently shown that they are, open to having monitors on their program and not pursuing a nuclear weapon. But what we've done, our policies, our decisions have potentially, could at least, change that calculus. Because if you look at the way that the US has carried itself in the world, why is it that we're not engaging in direct combat with, say, Russia? Because Russia is a nuclear armed state. More and more, our actions make it seem like having a nuclear weapon is protection. So it's our own policies that we should be thinking about, rather than assuming that it's always someone else that's about to do something.
No, I think that's a really, really important point. And again, I mean, just to remind folks too that, as part of the NPT, they were supposed to, the nuclear powers were supposed to help countries develop nuclear for civilian purposes. Like that was a huge part of the deal. And, just saying from my perspective, I think nuclear power is very important. And it's something that, we desperately need to be pursuing across the board. And to decide that, unilaterally from the US, at least, that one country can't pursue this kind of basic technology at this point. It's such a slap in the face that it's ridiculous that we have to even be arguing about it, but that's the world that we're living in. And it's incredibly frustrating to sit here with Democratic control of Congress and the presidency and not see much movement on trying to bring peace and diplomacy here.
Or on anything else.
Yeah. Well, Assal, this was such a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the program sometime in the future. People should definitely check out Assal on Twitter. She is a phenomenal follow. And also check out the National Iranian American Council. They do incredible work. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt and David.